Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 8, and this is session 15. Wow. If people only knew what went on in here during the break, oh my goodness. By the way, I will say this, just so you kind of know. We have some people flying into Midland from Norway in March, coming to visit. And they'll be here at the services. That's why they're coming, because they want to see this. And then we have some folks from Indiana that are coming in the first week of April, and they'll be here on Sunday. And then we have some folks from out in Florida that are coming in this summer, some folks from Oklahoma. And I know there's some other folks who want to come, but I don't know exactly when everybody's coming. But anyway, this is going to be a busy year for us. Last year, we kind of put everything on hold because of what was going on with me. But this year, it looks like Katie barred the door because... but I'm glad. I'm glad for all of that. So it'll be interesting. Okay, so session 15. While we had a little bit of a look at that side issue that I wanted to talk to you about, we need to get back over to Isaiah. And we were going back over there for a reason. Remember, I told you some general things about the prophets and then kind of the format for how each of those prophets writes, starting at the time where he is and ending up, out there in the final part of the fifth course of punishment and the kingdom and things that have to do with that. But where I really wanted to take us now is in Isaiah chapter 8, because if you'll remember what we're looking at back in Romans 9, verses 30 to 33 is the issue of Israel stumbling. That's the issue there. And so I'm going to take you back over here in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 14. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So on the Bible Safari, there's some things to fill in right here. So who will Christ be a sanctuary for? That's different. Look, see the first part of that separated by a colon? And I know we just jumped into the verse instead of reading the verses that came before this. And he shall be for a sanctuary. Who would you guess that the Lord will be a sanctuary for? Yeah, exactly, yeah. So here it is. Who will Christ be a sanctuary for? The believing remnant. Then... and who will Christ be a stumbling stone to? Yeah, okay. So I just put unbelieving Israel. You could put apostate Israel or any of that. And then who will have Christ for a rock of offense? Unbelieving Israel once again. By the way, a rock of offense is not the same thing as the stumbling stone issue. Those are two different aspects of their rejection. And we'll get a chance to talk about both of those. I hope we'll get it done in this session. I was actually thinking we're going to get further than we got. And we were going to finish Romans 9, we'll be in Romans 10 next week. Linda's smiling. She looked down and smiled like, I don't know why anybody ever thought that. Okay, so anyway, so here in verse 15 in Isaiah 8, we really have a timeline for what's going to be happening with Israel. We're going to have, if we could, let me look back and see if that whole thing there, that stumbling and that rock of offense, and if we have that next verse, and many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. There's the timeline. That's everything that's going on here. They'll stumble, and then they'll fall, and they'll be broken, and be snared, and be taken. Look, I know we haven't talked about the last things in this verse. We will, but let me just do the first part. So they stumble. Be careful now. Where do they stumble? Not before the cross. That's not the stumbling. What is that? Prior to the cross. All right, let's just put a timeline up here. All right, so here's the cross. Here's the days of the Messiah. What results in the cross is not their stumbling. What results in that is the rejection. Where do we get that? It's not sitting in this verse, But remember, Jesus quotes a verse of them and says, the stone which the builders rejected, God hath made the head of the corner. Who are the builders? We covered this before. Yeah, the religious leaders in Israel. Who's the stone? Yeah. So the stone, or Jesus Christ, that the builders, the religious leaders, rejected, God will make the head of the corner. And you know what? I wanted to illustrate this. I just forgot to get it. But then what God says is, I will lay a stone in Zion. And now He's talking about out here in that extension of mercy. I lay a stone in Zion. What I want to do is use this. I wanted to bring a rock in and put it on the platform and go. It was like God actually took this stone and they rejected it. I mean, He sent His Son, right? They reject Him. Then God says, I'm going to take this stone, I'm going to put it right down in your way, and you're going to have to deal with that stone. And so if you don't respond to Him properly, you will stumble over that, and He'll be a stumbling stone. And so that stumbling, folks, the stumble takes place in the extension of mercy. Where is the fall? There's the third thing. Right. At the stoning of Stephen. What does the fall represent? What is it? If it's Israel's fall, what does that mean? I mean, I know in the terminology, let's take Linda for example. First you stumble, and then you fall. And then you go to the hospital. But I didn't see that up there. I didn't see the hospital part up there. All right. So, sorry, I'm not making fun.
Yes, you are.
But okay, I am. Okay. But, all right, so what is the fall? Other than in that analogy of a stumble and a fall, tell me what the fall is in actuality.
The interruption.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the interruption of the program right there. So everything from here back, that's when God's working His program with Israel.
Huh? It is, if you think about it, it's the stopping or the interruption of your walking or your running or whatever you're doing. When you stumble and you fall, that is the interruption of it.
Or ramping.
Or ramping. You know.
I'm just.
It just stops.
Right.
Things interrupted. That doesn't mean that you die.
Right, but you're not going to continue. Right. And just like for Israel, for a time. Yeah. And so, and that's what Paul's answering, by the way, in this Romans 9, 10, and 11 thing is, God hasn't permanently done away with Israel. This fall is not going to be permanent. But it did happen, and we're supposed to view that in a very particular way. We'll be looking at that, but there's a way they're supposed to look at it, and there's a way we're supposed to see that as well. Okay, so now let's see where we're going to. And so here's what Isaiah is going to say now, because we're over in Isaiah 8. We're going to, if we had backed up just a chapter, you would see that Isaiah is going to talk about the greatest sign that was ever given to Israel. And so let's just go back and read that verse. I hope we can. Oh, no. Well, no, it's on your note taker. I mean on the Bible Safari this way. The greatest sign ever given to Israel is talked about in Isaiah 7:14. And it's the sign. You'll have to fill that in the best way you can. But there are three parts to that sign, and here they are. And let me just read the verse, and you can pick them out as we read. Therefore the Lord Himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel. And I know most of the time we have a tendency to just look at that as, that's the virgin birth, and that's the sign. But the sign actually has three parts to it, and they're very specific. So here it is. Number one, a virgin shall conceive. That would be an anomaly for sure, which is why a lot of the accusations against Mary were made, against Mary and Joseph, but she was indeed a virgin who conceived. The second part was, she'll bear a son. Well, that is a part of the sign because she could have had a daughter. If she'd had a daughter, guess what? Then that would not be the fulfillment of Isaiah 7. But she had a son. And here's the third one. She would call his name Immanuel. That's very significant. First of all, how many women were claiming that their children were born without a human father? Not a lot. And of those that did, and I don't know of any others that did, they would have to have a son, and then the mother would have to call his name Immanuel. This next one is on y'all's Bible Safari too. Immanuel means God with us. Who would have the audacity to name their child, who call their child that? To look at this baby and go, this is God now dwelling among us. Unless she knew something about who He was. That's the only way that would happen. That is not a sign that was ever repeated in Israel. Okay, so let's look at it this way. If you're in Israel and you know anything about the prophet Isaiah, and suddenly you hear these rumors that there's a woman over here who claims to have given birth to a son, and there is no human father, you may have a tendency to look at that and go, yeah, right. But isn't there something sitting in Isaiah that should be creeping into your thinking and making you think, you know, what she's saying reminds me of something back there in Isaiah. And then you hear that she's actually calling him Immanuel. Well, you know that would be sitting back there in that verse too. See, at the very least, that should make you what? Curious. Yeah, it should make you think, okay, now wait a minute. If this sounds wild, this is exactly what the prophet said it would be like. And by the way, it needed to be wild. Do you know why? Otherwise, everybody would have been doing it, and how would you know who the Messiah was? So if you're hearing that, and you're looking at him, and this is the guy who grows up to do what? Take a few loaves and fishes and feed 5,000 with 12 baskets left over. This is the guy who walks on water. This is the guy who gives the blind their sight. This is the guy who casts out unclean spirits. This is the guy that makes the lame walk. If you had been looking at him all along and wondering, when you saw all the things that he was doing, and by the way, those things were not just out of the blue, those were all talked about back in the Old Testament prophets. That's how you would know him. Not only that, you have 4 gospel writers that are... When Zechariah, remember these guys here? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. In Zechariah, that's where you have those 4 beholds, those 4 different ways that Israel was to behold their Messiah. When the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing, they're actually focusing on one of those ways that Israel is to behold their Messiah. And when Matthew starts out, he is presenting him as the king, because that's what Zechariah says. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee, meek and lowly, and riding upon an ass, a colt the foal of an ass. How many kings came into Jerusalem riding on the colt of a donkey? No, they come in riding on a white stallion. It's different. It's not copied. How many of them were claimed to be born of a virgin? None of them. How many of them were called Immanuel? None of them. That's the whole point. These were all observable. And so when Matthew writes, you know what how does he start? So he's going to present Christ as king. What's the very first thing he does? He takes his genealogy all the way back to David. to show how he qualifies in the kingly line. It's the royal genealogy. And he lays it out and says, you can't disqualify this guy because of his lineage, because here's the lineage back to David. I mean, that's great stuff. When Mark starts his, he doesn't do a genealogy because he's not talking about him as the king. Luke does, but it's a different genealogy. And where does that one go back to? It doesn't go back to David or Abraham. It goes back to Adam. Because now Luke is talking about him as the Son of Man. And there's a whole doctrine about that they're supposed to behold. Now, I know you kind of heard these things before. Not everybody on the tape has. But look, I'm just trying to say, was there any evidence there? Why am I saying this? Because in Romans chapter 10, let me just say it to you like this. In Romans 9, in the first part of that chapter, when we got down to verse 29, we went through 3 objections that the members of the little flock gave about why hasn't God come back to do with us what He said He was going to do? Why is He still working with Gentiles? Why doth He yet find fault? Remember all of that? But when you get into chapter 10, now Paul is going to deal with some objections from unbelieving Israel. And you know what their first objection is? How could we believe on Him? Nobody told us about Him. That's what they're going to claim. Nobody said anything to us. How are we supposed to believe in Him of whom we have not heard? God didn't do a very good job of telling us. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? He gave you from the prophet that a virgin would conceive, she would bear a son, she would call his name Immanuel, that a forerunner would show up in the wilderness. It described what he'd be wearing and what he'd be eating. And it talked about his message. And here comes John down at the River Jordan, and when Jesus shows up, he points at him and says, "Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world." That ought to have been another clue. And then, you know what you've got? You've got his genealogy being written down that takes him all the way back to David and to Abraham. If he goes to David, he's got to go to Abraham, doesn't he? And you've got all this evidence, and here's Israel with the audacity to say, "Hey, Paul, get off your high horse about why we didn't trust him. Nobody told us about him." Really? I thought there were 12 disciples that you guys were really interested in tormenting because they were talking about him. How can both of those things be true? So when I'm talking about these things are things that if you're in Israel and you were seeing everything that he did, the miracles he performed, and looking back at the scriptures that described all of those things, that should be making you look at him and go, this has got to be him. Show me one thing that the prophet said he would do that he hasn't done. And then show me anybody else that's even come close. No one in Israel. Then you got a timetable sitting over there in Daniel. And if you knew what time it was, you would have been looking anyway. Okay, look, I kind of got off of my high horse here. So I'll calm down a minute. But I want to tell you, I don't know if we'll get to it today, but the way I'm going, who knows? Okay, Linda was right. But look, there's a guy at the temple who does know what time it is. And he's looking. And when they bring Jesus in, when he's 8 days old, to have him circumcised, you know what he does? We're going to read it. He identifies who he is and what's going to be happening to him. Do you know why? He knows what's sitting back in the prophets. He knows what time it is. He can look at Daniel's prophecy and know exactly where he is on the timeline and what to be expecting. And when that baby is born, he knows exactly who that is. You're telling me you're a religious leader in Israel and you don't know that? Oh, but the problem is not so much that they don't know it. It's that they don't like it. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to go about how they might put him to death. Now, at first, they don't bother too much because you know what? When he first comes on the scene, nobody really knows everything he's going to do. But when he starts to get a following, the more of a following he gets, the more attention he gets from those religious leaders. Take a lesson there. Right now, nobody knows anything about this group right here. But the time will come when they do. And the more they know, the more they won't like it. It'll work the same way. It's not going to be any different. Now I know what, as I say that, I know that in your mind you may be thinking, we need to keep flying under the radar for a while. I get that. But look, there's going to come a time where we're going to make decisions about things whereby we cannot fly under the radar anymore. We don't have to try to go out there ahead of time and make it known. It will manifest itself in the natural function of our sonship lives. And you got to know that the more impact we make, the more unhappy the world will be and Satan will be. Anyway, I'm just trying to draw a parallel there. Things have been a little too light, so I thought I'd sober everybody up for a minute. Actually, I kind of liked them light, but anyway. So, 7:14, look at this next verse, 7:15. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both of her kings. You know what that's saying? Before this virgin conceives and bears a son and calls his name Immanuel, before that happens, here's one of the things that you're going to know. Both Israel and Judah are going to be forsaken of both of their kings. You know what? They're going to go under Gentile dominion. Was that true? Absolutely. Who was in charge when Jesus showed up? The Romans. Who was in charge of Israel before that? The Greeks. Who was in charge of Israel before that? The Medes and Persians. Who was in charge of Israel before that? The Babylonians, and they're the ones that took them captive. And you can make a direct line. Now someone looks at Israel today and they go, yeah, well, they're not under Gentile dominion today. Yeah, but we're not in Israel's program today. Israel has already fallen. That's back there in the early chapters of the book of Acts. When this dispensation of grace is over and Israel's program resumes, I'm going to tell you for an absolute fact, because God said it in His Word, they will be back under the dominion of Gentiles. So all those folks that claim them becoming a nation in 1948 and they never get plucked up again and never do this and never do that, have failed to rightly divide. I'm sorry. I hate it when I do that. I started to say they failed to rightly divide the word of truth. They did. But let me just take it one step further. I'm not talking about rightly dividing the word of separating Israel's program from the dispensation of grace. That's true. That's true. But do you know you have to be able to rightly divide Israel's program in its own program? Because those instructions to them are fluid and they change through Israel's program. It's not like the way it was in the very beginning with Israel is the way it is, at the end. There are some things that are different. Some things have changed. Well, anyway, maybe one day we'll expand on that. I'm just thinking about it. 2 minutes. Not going to try to do that here. Okay, so let's just read the rest of these few verses and see if we can get through Isaiah. So back to Isaiah 8:8. He shall pass through Judah, overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck. The stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Immanuel. Wait a minute. She would call his name what? See, Isaiah's picking up on that thing in chapter 7, and when he gets over to chapter 8, he's not only talking about the stumbling and the fall of Israel, But now he's talking, when he talks about Immanuel and his land, he's using that same terminology that he was using back there in chapter 7. Verse 10. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, for it shall not stand, for God is what? What was third part of the sign? They shall call his name Immanuel. And what does that mean? Do you see this? Do you see how the prophet is picking this up and just taking this through? When you realize what's sitting there, this whole book begins to just kind of knit itself together. All right, so I know I'm not going to have time to do this, but when we come back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the other side of the coin. One side of the coin is he is the stumbling stone. The other side of the coin is he's the rock of offense. Both of those are the response of unbelieving Israel. So what we'll do next Sunday is we'll pick this up about what does it mean that he is a rock of offense? In what way is God using that? Now we may have said a couple things about that, but what I want to do is take you over and show you the verses about that, because that's the very word that's used in Isaiah, an offense, that's going to be used over in the gospel accounts when it says that they looked at him and they were offended in him. And so we'll take a look at that, and then we're going to come back to Romans 9, and we will next Sunday finish up that chapter, and then we'll get into Romans chapter 10. We have so much good stuff waiting for us in Romans chapter 10, because what you're going to see unfold is the excuses now that unbelieving Israel is going to make to say, well, wait a minute, Paul, if what you're saying is true, that's not fair, because, and then they're going to start going through a few excuses there. That first one I've already given you. God didn't give us a fair chance. We didn't know anything about him. And so Paul, he's going to answer them. We're going to look at his answers. It's going to be very interesting. Because it's Romans 10, we're also going to set the record straight on a couple of verses that get pulled out of context and used completely wrong. I want us to see them for what they really are. And I am very excited. And can I say this right here at the end? Romans 11. There were some things about the tree with some of the branches broken off and then other branches grafted in, and then those being broken off, the original branches grafted back in. And you know, I look at that and I look at that, and there were some things there that I thought were it just needed to be clearer. And when we talked through this the first time, I didn't get it wrong, but I didn't define things as well as I should have defined them. And so I was really in a quandary about this Romans 11 thing. Okay, look, Mark, cut us off right here. Let me just give you 30 seconds of this, and I'll let